Okay, if I could have your attention again. Sorry about that truncated fellowship time. I wondered now, Brian, if you'd like to come up and introduce Carmen, thanks.
Well, I will when they stop chattering. Carmen Dalli is Professor of Early Childhood Education at Victoria University. She's also the Associate Dean for the Faculty of Education at Victoria. She's a director and was in fact one of the founding spirits of the Institute for Early Childhood Studies, which is resident there. And she's Associate Director of the Jessie Hetherington Centre for Educational Research. Outside this sphere, she's very active in the European Early Childhood Education Research Association, and within that's co-convener of a special interest group examining professionalism in early childhood education. And that's the subject of two books which she has co-edited in 2010 and 2012. Currently, she's the joint editor of a number of books that are being published by Springer in coming years. Something about her own post-toddler education might be relevant. She graduated with a bachelor's degree in Malta and began her academic teaching career in Malta, gained a master's degree in education at University of Bristol and her doctorate at Victoria University of Wellington. And with that somewhat exotic background, she is currently the honorary consul for Malta in Wellington and the South Island. And anyone who has travel interests in Malta, as one of our members has, is welcome to consult her after the talk. Come forward.
Well, thank you, Brian, for that introduction, and thank you all for having me here today. As Brian just said, I work at Victoria and have done so since I arrived in New Zealand in 1986, which is 30 years ago now. So I'm more Kiwi than Maltese, actually, which is, of course, the accent you can still hear as I speak. Some of you probably have been to Malta, but for those who haven't, Malta is a little island in the middle of the Mediterranean, and it's got a very interesting connection to New Zealand. Not just because we're both Commonwealth countries, but also because in the First World War, Malta was the nurse of the Mediterranean. So it's actually the resting place for many New Zealand soldiers that didn't make it back. And Anzac Day in Malta is still commemorated annually with a certain religious regularity. It's a very religious country, and it applies to this commemoration as well. There's another connection from the Second World War, when Mussolini committed Italy as an ally of Germany in 1940. Within hours, Malta was under air attack from Italian aircraft. But it didn't have any defense aircraft at all. However, there were 4 disassembled Gloucester Gladiator biplanes belonging to the Navy. They were packed in crates ready to go off to Egypt. But a New Zealander was heading the Royal Air Force in Malta. His name was Keith Park. And he broke with protocol and gave the order to unpack the crates, assemble the biplanes, and off they were flying. So 3 of them flew, and 1 of them was kept back for spare parts. And it was actually those 3 planes, they were fondly nicknamed Hope, Faith, and Charity. There's still 1 of them in the War Museum, if any of you get there to have a look at. So he didn't earn himself many favors with the Navy. However, in 1942, he became Sir Keith Park, and that was a knighthood to honor his contribution to the defense of Malta. And of course, he then came back to New Zealand, became an Auckland City Councillor, and also was instrumental in convincing the government to buy the land at Mangere on which the international airport lives. So that's a little bit of connection with New Zealand and Malta. I love finding these little connections. Of course, in my role as Honorary Consul, they're also come quite useful. However, so small wonder then, with that background, that as a newly minted master's graduate in London, when I met a Kiwi who was similarly newly minted with a master's degree and an Air Force pilot, I became a romantic emigrant to Wellington, New Zealand, where I have lived ever since. But that's not what really I should be talking about. I should be talking about starting childcare and what matters, so I'll do that. What matters starting early childhood education? Well, I'm going to say that three things matter. And I'm mainly going to speak or spend most time on the first thing that matters. So firstly, what matters is the relationships with the teachers. That's what matters most. Secondly, the structural elements in which teachers work matter. And thirdly, a supportive policy infrastructure matters. So a key reason for talking about this topic is that entering early childhood, group-based early childhood centres at a younger age is becoming a normal part of most children's lives. This is a global phenomenon. OECD figures for 2013 show that 33% of all under 3-year-olds in 30 of the 38 member states attend some form of formal early childhood service. That's a 10% increase over the previous 10 years. So these figures are mirrored also in New Zealand, with the largest growth rate being for 2-year-olds. So the latest figures show that 65% of all 2-year-olds in New Zealand attend some form of formal early childhood service. And hours of attendance have also increased to 21.7%, 21.7 hours per week. So what this means is that now, as never before, children are experiencing their childhood in a very different way to previous generations. And this makes it imperative that we know the answer to that question. What matters? What matters to ensure that children have a good childhood in early childhood centres? I've spent the best part of 30 years here in New Zealand working on this question. What matters? It started in my PhD during the 90s, when having set out to explore what the policy rhetoric of the time called parent-teacher partnerships, what that meant in practice, I ended up switching focus and instead following 5 children as each went through the orientation and then the settling in into their early childhood centre. The reason I switched is because in my pilot study, both the teachers and the parents that I interviewed insisted that partnership starts from the moment the child enters the early childhood centre. And if I wanted to understand it, that's where I should look. So I did. I spent 10 months shadowing 5 under 3-year-olds, roughly 2 months per child, whenever they went to the centre. I observed them from the moment they arrived till the moment they left. I videoed parts of their day. I interviewed the parents, I interviewed the teachers. I asked the adults to keep journals, and then I analysed those and talked about them with them. So at the same time as that was going on, I was also working with a national working group to develop the Early Childhood Code of Ethics that came into force in 1995. That was the first Code of Ethics, incidentally, for all education in New Zealand. The primary and secondary Code of Ethics came later. We have since run the survey that helped us to do that work twice at 10-year intervals. So we've got 3 lots of data over 30 years. And what we get from that is all of these examples about the kind of challenging situations that early childhood teachers meet in their daily practice. And through it also learn what teachers think that professional early childhood practice should look like, including with the very youngest children. More recently, I've worked with teachers in a number of centres for under 2-year-olds as they have been using research to critically analyse and improve their practice. And at the Institute for Early Childhood Studies, which Brian mentioned, we do contract research for government agencies from time to time. And a few years ago, one of these was a huge literature search. I think it was like 4,756 articles that we had to sift through. Of course, culled a lot of that out. But what we were trying to answer was the question of what makes a difference? What should quality look like for under 2-year-olds? So all of that background feeds into my 3 answers to the question of what matters. So let me go through each of my 3 points. As I said, the longest is the first one. So the first answer to what matters is relationships. Relationships with the teachers matter. Not just any relationship, but a relationship in which the teacher is sensitive to the subtle cues that the child gives, including about their temperament and the characteristics that go with their age. So it's not just any relationship with any teacher, but a relationship with a teacher who is knowledgeable about his, or hopefully his role, but mainly her role, teachers in early childhood centres. We have not been able to up the 5% of the male workforce in the sector. So this is particularly important when the teacher is just getting to know a new child of whatever age, but especially it's important with infants and toddlers, which is the age most children now enter early childhood centres. So although infants and toddlers may not express themselves articulately as an adult would, research over the last few years has made it very clear that even very young children have elaborate communicative competencies. For example, we know quite a lot about the way that under 1-year-olds use gestures to signify their meaning. We know that babies pay more attention to dynamic new faces and learn them faster than static images. And this parallels the way that they follow the gaze when they're trying to understand where are you looking, what's taking your interest. You may have noticed this with your children or grandchildren. We know that infants learn very fast to use their vocalizations as a very effective social tool. And this is well established by the age of 5 months. All of this has implications for how adults should interact with infants and toddlers. In particular, with under 2-year-olds, it's been shown that the serve and return interactions between adults and children promote reciprocity in interaction and create what's referred to as intersubjective attunement. What this is referring to are those interactions, a bit like an analogy that's often used is it's like a ping pong game or a table tennis exchange. You serve the ball and then you wait for it to be returned, and then the way that you serve it back depends on how it's been returned to you. So in other words, what you're doing in this serve and return interaction, this intersubjective attunement, is you're making the child's contribution in the exchange the focus of what you do next. So when an infant's contributions or vocalizations are welcomed and responded to in this way, the child learns to vocalize more. Because the adult's response shows them that their vocalizations produce a result. So if the adult's response is appropriate and shows awareness of the child's needs, then there's a feeling of close emotional attachment that grows between the child and the adult. And the child will seek out that adult with whom they have that sense of closeness, especially when they need comfort. That adult becomes their secure base, the one to whom they retreat in situations of stress, and to whom they look for guidance when they're uncertain how to react in a new situation. So attachment relationships of this kind teach children about things like trust, about reciprocity in communication, about care. And these, of course, are all elements of well-functioning interpersonal relationships, whatever the age. So research about working with infants and toddlers gives the psychological concepts of reciprocity, sensitive responsiveness, and intersubjectivity great attention. What they mean for early childhood teachers is that they need to take on a number of roles in their practice. They need to be an attachment figure, they need to be a partner in what sometimes people call a relational dance. You dance, you try not to tread on others' toes, you keep in sync with each other. The adult is a mediator who opens up the world to the child. In the early years, learning is primarily about children acquiring a sense of identity, gaining language, and a sense that they belong, that they can contribute, that they're worthy of attention. These learning outcomes, these dimensions of being human, are interactive. and they're learned in social settings within a culture. They're not innate. They have to be learned. Excuse me. So, sensitive responsive caregiving helps children to acquire these learnings. And what neurobiological research is increasingly showing us is that this kind of caregiving is the key environmental factor needed for optimal brain development. It wires up the brain for learning. By contrast, lack of this type of sensitive responsive caregiving constrains the developing brain and creates what people call black holes in the architecture of the brain that can persist throughout a lifetime. So it matters that children encounter adults in early childhood centers who are knowledgeable about the kinds of interactions that children thrive on and can engage in those interactions effectively and with sensitivity. It also matters that the teachers are knowledgeable about building relationships with the parents who entrust their precious children to them. For families, starting to use an early childhood center for their child is never easy. In fact, it has even been shown to cause maternal separation anxiety. There's a scale for this to measure it. In my own research, I found that when settling in their child, parents inevitably are beset by fears for the child and worries about whether they're doing the right thing. Guilt is never far from the surface. Traditional images of ideal motherhood, sitting at home surrounded with beautifully behaved, happy children, still haunt many women as they make the decision to go back to work. Could they trust the teacher to offer the best that they themselves could offer? What happens when they're not there? Is their child old enough? Is it ready for a childcare? What if they get hurt? Would their child be looked after or would they be ignored? And they wanted to keep on side with the teacher in order not to give her a reason to not like my child. There are many hidden power issues at play. What the mothers desperately wanted was evidence that their child would be well looked after, loved even. But what then if the child ended up loving the teacher more than them? This complex array of emotions is very hard on parents. And while the memory of them fades in intensity with the passage of time, they are very difficult to navigate when you're going through them. So, it matters that teachers are knowledgeable about how parents feel and can draw on strategies that can reassure parents. This starts to build the basis for a collaborative and supportive relationship, even partnership. There are strategies to do this. One of them is the establishment of a primary caregiver system. And one of the centers that I've worked with really tried to put this into practice, putting it to the parents that it isn't something just for the child when they're in the center, but it's also a service for them, so that they can get to know the parent, they can get to know about the child from the parents, and the parents continue to feel involved in their child's life. And that way also dispel the fears they might have about the teacher possibly supplanting the mother's role in the affections of the child, which never happens, because children will stay with the parents forever, but the fear is there. So that was my first point. Relationships with teachers matter. Not just any relationship with any teacher, but a particular type of relationship with knowledgeable teachers who understand the importance of interaction that is skewed to the child's signals, and the importance of working alongside parents to guide them and reassure them as they handle this major transition in the life of their family. The second point I wanted to make is that it matters that the environments children go into are low-stress environments that actively avoid toxic stress or are able to buffer children against toxic stress. Toxic stress occurs in situations where the child has no control over events and no access to support from an adult who can soothe them. So this arises in situations of low-quality care, whether that's in an early childhood center or in the home. It's what prevents the development of a history of attuned caregiving, which creates those, all that learning that I mentioned earlier. So by contrast, low-stress environments are correlated with healthy brain development because in low-stress environments, attuned care and supportive relationships are much more possible. Fortunately, we know quite a lot about how to create low-stress environments, and most of what is needed is amenable to policy intervention through regulations. No surprises here about what is needed. There are things like the ratio of adults to children, the number of children in the group, staff qualifications, the noise levels in the centre, how the building is physically structured, which will either make a place noisy or create quiet, calm spaces for children. To just elaborate briefly on two of those structural elements. Excuse me. In terms of ratios, we know that the ideal ratios for working with under 2s is 1 adult to 3 children. Our regulations say 1:3. But ratios by themselves are not sufficient to guarantee good outcomes. They interact with other factors. Ratios provide preconditions for positive interactions, but the nature of the child-teacher interactions is determined by other factors, such as, for example, the levels of staff satisfaction, and that is very strongly correlated with the levels of pay. So together, those factors define the possibilities and limitations of experiences for children and staff. Of course, having more adults means it costs more money. But the higher cost of this can be mitigated by low staff turnover, as improved working conditions and job satisfaction reduces stress, and that creates continuity for the children. When it comes to staff qualifications, we also know quite a lot. For example, we know that it's important that qualified staff have up-to-date professional understandings about children of specific age groups, and that higher qualifications are associated with more positive attitudes towards infants and toddlers as learners. We also know that with higher qualified staff, you have more inclusive practices in early childhood services. It therefore stands to reason that early childhood teacher education programs should include a focus on very young children as learners and on inclusive practices. And so, to the point that I want to conclude on. It matters to have a supportive policy infrastructure. Clearly, the structural arrangements within which teachers work, their qualification backgrounds, their level of knowledge, the adult-child ratios in their place of work are intricately connected to the types of interaction that teachers are able to engage in with children. The relationships that matter when children and families share the care of their children with early childhood settings are not merely the product of actions by one teacher, but rather they rely on a network of supportive connections between teachers and children, teachers and teachers, the structural elements of the centre, including the centre's philosophy and leadership style, all of which are also located within a broader policy infrastructure. In some of my more policy-focused work, I have talked about this intersection of policy and practice and the need for policy to act like a supportive membrane for practice. So you see, my 3 points about what matters for children starting early childhood education had one key refrain. I repeated the words and concept of knowledgeable. This is critical and only flows from good training for teachers, good ratios, and a great policy infrastructure. When these work together, it's not only children's learning and development and families that benefit, but society as a whole, because we are laying the foundations for well-being now and for the future. Thank you.
I'm really sorry, Carmen, we've run out of time for questions. So what we'll do is, I'm sure Carmen will stay around a few minutes and people can email her if they'd like to have some more elucidation of her fascinating subject. Brian, have you got a couple of words?
Yes.
In summary.
In summary. Well, if I can stay with my generational difference theme that I spoke to Carmen earlier. When I was an early child, ECE was in the home. There was the beginnings of the play centre movement, and kindergartens were few and far between. And education didn't really start until you'd had your 5th birthday. But it's clear from what Carmen has had to say that now the same attention and prestige is being given to the years before 5 that they deserve. So we thank you very much for that enlightening background. Thank you.
Now, I know there are a number of people who want to have give messages to fellow Rotarians. So Lee, anyone else? Now, if you've been up the last 2 weeks, you might want to think about putting it on the website instead of Stuart.
I've been up before.
No, but you got me to do it twice.
That's not coming up.
Thanks, Kerry, members and guests. Ramsey and I are going to have a go in March year at taking responsibility for his newsletter. And we'd be keen to have one or two other people help us out, both with ideas about how it could go and also being willing to, in particular, the challenges, making sure someone's here each meeting to get a summary of the very interesting presenters that we have. So if you're interested in giving us a hand, I don't think it's going to be onerous, and it would be really great to have you along.
Kerry and members, on the tables in front of you is the flyer for another Successful Singers to Listen For event. This is the annual fundraiser this year for the Gillies McIndoe Research Institute for Cancer. Please take the flyer with you. This club loyally supported the event last year, and those of you who bought tickets received a $70 per ticket donation receipt. Thank you. You got an added bonus this year. For just 4 weeks, there's an early bird ticket of $120 before the price goes back to the $140. That will expire on the 20th of July, so please be an early bird.
President, guests and fellows, wine options, it's the same as always, only this time it's going to be more fun. We're actually going to have smaller teams, and we are going to actually give you some lessons on what to be looking for before we go. So, I mean, we can, if you want to make up a team of 10 or 12, that's fine, but we really want to have teams of 6 or 7 or 8, because that's really ideal for making it more enjoyable for everybody. So please fill in the form on the table. If your form isn't filled in, or you want to take a form home, if you see me, I'll give you one to take home, or you can take the one home if there's no names on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stuart, and thank you for organising the wine for the function the other night. Look, just before we finish, can I thank you, Carmen, for your address today. I've known Carmen since I was in local body politics, and Carmen was the Maltese Consul General. So it's nice to see you again in your professional role. Could I also acknowledge the 3 Rotarians who are here again today. Thank you very much for coming. So Craig, Howard and Peter, it's great to see you, and you're welcome any time to not just the oldest but the best club in the country, and arguably the biggest, but I'm not so sure on that one. And then congratulations again to all the Paul Harris Fellowship recipients, and Martin in particular for receiving yours today. And then when I looked at what happened this day in history, because we're short of time, I'll just mention 2 things that happened on this day that are perhaps relevant. I couldn't find anything about early childhood education. It didn't happen this day in history. But in 1967, on this day, Muhammad Ali, who was recently buried, was convicted in Houston of violating selective service laws by